All right, this is Professor St. Clair here, of course. History 117, Chapter 20 is the transformation of Europe. And of course, that's the title, Transformation of Europe. They don't say what it's transforming from or to, but we might get into that. I'm not going to get into the details. There's a lot of stuff covered in here. The Reformation, where Protestantism gets created by Luther mainly, and then a guy named John Calvin. And then in England, there's the English Reformation, where Henry VIII decides that in order to get a divorce, he's going to split the church from the Catholic Church, the English Church from the Catholic Church. It leads to a series of wars that are highly destructive. The 30 Years' War in Germany kills off about a third of the population, which is an enormous number. There's 36 years of war between Protestants and Catholics in France. Anabaptists are hunted down by everybody who's not an Anabaptist. And Reformation is one of those words that I call them shorthand words. You don't want to have to explain the whole thing. If you can just use a word like Reformation, and people say, oh yeah, the Protestant Reformation, blah, blah, Catholic, there's a Catholic counter-Reformation. But these words kind of color our perceptions of things. Reform is basically change for the better, so a Reformation is a big change for the better. Something like that. And it could just as easily be called the age of religious schisms and wars, you know. People killed each other over the idea that the bread and wine was either actually the body and blood of Christ, or the bread and wine were symbols of the body and blood of Christ. Okay. There's Jonathan Swift is an author, a very satirical author. He wrote Gulliver's Travels, and in Gulliver's Travels, in one of the lands, there's a war going on because people can't decide. One side thinks you should open the narrow end of your soft-boiled egg, and the other side thinks you should open the wider end of the soft-boiled egg. And he's making fun of people killing each other over these religious differences. And so that's one part of this transformation, the breaking of the monolithic hold of the Catholic Church on people's minds. Another part of the transformation is building up nation states, which are different than kingdoms, okay? England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, eventually Germany, and other Eastern countries will all become nation states. But in this particular period, the 16th and 17th centuries, it starts with monarchs basically establishing control of the country without having to deal with the nobles, the aristocrats, who earlier would have regarded the king as, you know, first among equals or something like that. Not really the all-powerful ruler. But in this period, you start getting what they call absolutist monarchies, right? Absolutist monarchs. And the reason they're able to do this is because a new class has arrived on the scene in Europe. Let's see, Bourgeoisie, okay? And Bourgeoisie. Okay. The bourgeoisie. For centuries, very few people in Europe have known how to read. Okay, yeah, it's mainly an oral culture, and then and they don't know much else. You know, what we used to call the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. Europe was very stagnant. Things didn't change much. People didn't think new thoughts, or if they did think new thoughts, they kept them from themselves, so they didn't get burned at the stake or some other horrible torture. But with the Crusades, which was a war against the Muslims in the Holy Land, that they call, the biblical Holy Land, you start getting different ideas coming into Europe. I mentioned in the last class, the last lecture, the last video, paper, numbers, Arabic numbers, gunpowder, and knowledge of the Greek language coming into Europe as a result of the Crusades. Okay? The other thing that starts happening with the Crusades is that certain merchants in Italian city-states like Genoa and Venice begin to make a lot of money transporting troops to the Holy Land, and then picking up materials to sell back in Europe. Things that Europe didn't have before. They didn't have access to this stuff before. And the Muslim merchants in the Middle East have access to this whole trade network that Muslims have on the Indian Ocean. Okay? So you start coming back with spices, ebony and ivory from East Africa, all sorts of stuff. And if you're a merchant in business and you're hired to take a bunch of crusaders to the Holy Land with their supplies and their horses and their armaments and their pages and all that stuff, and you drop them off, you don't want to go back to Italy empty-handed. You want to fill that ship up with stuff you can sell. Silk, I don't know, all the stuff that's available in the Indian Ocean. Right? And these people start to get very rich. Okay? Money rich. Not land rich like the aristocrats, but money rich. And they're still commoners, though. You can't... Being a noble, an aristocrat, is a blood thing. You have to, inherit it. So these people are commoners, but they're commoners with a lot of money. And a lot of money can always be transferred into actual political power, sooner or later. Okay? You can bribe the cardinals and get your son elected pope. You can convince the king of France to marry your daughter because her dowry is 3 times as large as any Bavarian princess who might be available. And so these people start to trade this. These Italian merchants begin to trade this stuff up into other parts of Europe, making other people wealthy in those parts of Europe. Now, this word here is pronounced bourgeoisie. It's a French word. Basically means city dweller. Mm-hmm. You could call them capitalists. You could call them the very rich. You could call them, I don't know what, anything you want. I like calling them the bourgeoisie because I like the bouge sound of it. Bouge. Bourgeoisie. Anyway, this is the main reason this transformation is, it's part of the main reason why this transformation is taking place in Europe, okay? Because these people can afford to educate their children, get educated themselves, both in literacy and in what's called numeracy, or the ability to keep records with numbers and statistics. Well, I don't know if statistics, but keep records of tax revenues and stuff like that. Okay, the bourgeoisie is literate. They live in cities. They are not tied to the land. They're capable of thinking other ways of thinking, and and they're not terribly afraid of the church. Okay, but this is one of the reasons this is all tied in together. The Reformation, the rise of the bourgeoisie, and then you get paper coming in, and Gutenberg invents the printing press, and so books become enormously much cheaper, and more people start to read and be literate. For the most part, peasants remain illiterate, but the bourgeoisie and their progeny are a literate class. And the monarchs, remember them? The monarchs are able to use the bourgeoisie as a sort of foil against the nobility, the aristocrats. In the past, if the king wanted to raise an army, he had to go to the different nobles who had obligations to him and have them raise up soldiers, and they would go down the line, and eventually he'd have an army. With the tax revenues that he gets from the bourgeoisie and their ability to organize things, these kings, these monarchs, start to set up what's called a standing army. It's an army that's in the barracks all the time, ready to go to war, which in Europe is very important because they're constantly fighting. So a standing army, he no longer has to rely on the nobles to provide him with troops. Same thing with taxation. In the old days, he had to have the nobles collect the taxes, and they would keep some for themselves and send the rest to the monarch, and the monarch had to worry about whether they were pocketing too much, etc., etc. Now he can set up a bureaucracy, a kind of internal revenue service, staffed by the bourgeoisie, staffed by literate people, and make sure that the taxation is fair and that that he's getting every penny he deserves or doesn't deserve. Every penny he's owed, basically. All right. Justice is the same thing. The bourgeoisie staffs. In England, there's justices of the peace are created. People that can read and write and have studied the law, or maybe not, but have studied the law and are now dispensing justice. And it becomes more uniform over the whole kingdom, and it becomes much more like a modern nation state, right? But it's a transitional, it's sort of a transitional stage of things, the absolute monarchs, okay? Then there's a section on early capitalist society that I think is worth digging into, okay? Capitalism has not always existed. It has not always been the case that people work for other people and get paid wages. Today was a payday for me, a great day. There was a raise in it. Because I have a union, we got a raise. In the Middle Ages, peasants worked for the nobles because the nobles were going to protect them from Vikings or invasions from the east or whatever. That was the rationalization, okay? And usually there was no way to adjust or negotiate that deal, right? The peasants worked for the nobles, and the nobles protected the peasants. They also provided spiritual welfare, a church, a chapel, and a priest, okay? And the Black Plague comes in, and there's a third of the population of Europe dies, creating a labor scarcity. So now it's possible for the peasants to negotiate their deals. And feudalism, which is what we call that system, although my professor Peggy Brown at Brooklyn College would not allow us to use the phrase feudalism because she said it wasn't a system at all. It was completely different in different places. But feudalism begins to break down. So you have it breaking down. You have these Italian merchants getting richer and richer, and people start a different way of thinking about things, which is basically that economic activity should be not for the good of the community necessarily, but for individual profit. Mm-hmm. And I think that's like the basis of where capitalism comes from. The book talks about proto-industrialization, which is another term my professors in grad school said was illegitimate. To give you an example of this, proto-industrialization, there's no factories. That's a later thing. Factories, a single building with many, many workers and machines and steam power and all that, that comes later, okay? This early what they call proto-industrialization, a particular merchant would bring like raw cotton that he got from Egypt or India or someplace, and he'd dish it out to a lot of peasant families in a place like Saxony in Germany. And those people would work on spinning the cotton into thread or yarn, and then weaving it into cloth. And they would have the spinning wheel and the loom in their house. And either the merchant was providing those machines, the spinning wheel and the loom, or the peasants themselves owned it. Okay. They're still doing some farming, but in their sort of spare time, they would do this cloth work, okay, which has tremendous ramifications in the countryside. Suddenly, people who used to have to wait for their parents to die before they got anything in life now have money from this merchant who they're selling, they're trading cloth, or they're employed making cloth. All right. That's one of the ways proto-industrialization works. Okay, you have these guilds, which are set up with apprentices, journeymen, and masters, and they the guilds start to hold back on certain processes. The guilds were very concerned with quality of the products that they were making. Like the Bootmakers Guild insisted on certain processes and stuff to make boots, but the capitalists are looking to cut corners and stuff like that. So there's a struggle between the guilds and the early capitalists. Some of the masters become capitalists. Some of them get driven out of business and become workers. But they start to change the processes in some cases, so that more can be produced, and that and it can be produced for profit, not just for use. Okay? In the Middle Ages, you would have a community, a manor, they called it. Maybe there's a castle and surrounded by fields, and the villagers live out in the fields, but the castle is there in times of attack. Maybe there was somebody in the village who made shoes. When everybody had a pair of shoes, he went on to something else. He did something else. Now, with the capitalists, they just keep making shoes and trying to sell them. Okay? I often ask my classes, how many pairs of shoes do people have? And nowadays, people have enormous numbers of pairs of shoes. But in 800, you'd be lucky if you had one pair of shoes. But the idea is you're producing things so you can sell them to make a profit, not so that you can provide people who don't have shoes with shoes. Okay? People that don't have money are not part of the market. they can't buy shoes, so you're not really interested in them if you're a capitalist. Okay. Another important idea is the joint stock company. These were very important. They're sort of the forerunners of corporations. They sold stock so that somebody who lived in the north of France could invest in a French company, a joint stock company that was trading maybe in the Indian Ocean or dealing in slaves or, furs from Canada or something like that. And you never had to leave your home, and you could get part of the profit from that traffic. Okay. And so the joint stock companies, there's a British East India Company, there's a Dutch VOC Company, which is Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, which is the same thing, the East India Company, the EIC. There's also a French one. I don't know its name. These companies begin to share the profits with investors all over Europe, creating more of a middle class. So you take somebody like a master shoemaker, and he's really making shoes. He's not just fixing heels and stuff. He's making shoes, and he's got extra money, and he invests in he's in England, so he invests in the Royal Africa Company. The Royal Africa Company has a monopoly on the slave trade from Africa. And so he's making money off the sale of slaves, the capture and sale of slaves, without ever leaving England, seeing a whip, a ship, shackles, the condition of the slaves, how the auction goes in Charleston, North Carolina. He doesn't see any of that. He invests his money and then he gets the profit. It's the magic of capitalism, really, if there is any magic in capitalism. Right? Let's see what else is in here. It's actually a lot of... I like that they don't call it, they call it on page 388, it's called Transformations in Scientific Thinking. But it is called the Scientific Revolution, okay? Which I would just warn you about that. Like Reformation, like the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution is a kind of shorthand word that we have to use, and we will use, but it may color our perception so that we think, well, before the scientific revolution, there wasn't really science. The Chinese and the Indians and, the ancient Greeks didn't really have science. Well, they did. Somebody in China invented gunpowder. Did they do that by accident? I always wonder about baking cakes. Like, how did people learn? How did humans learn to bake cakes? How much like experimentation did that take? And is that science? I think it is. The Indians come up with this number system that's far superior to Roman numerals, right? I think that's science. So there is a sort of transformation of scientific thinking, and I like that term. And we call it the scientific revolution, but don't get hung up on the word revolution, because that seems to indicate something brand new and something totally different. Okay? And some of the figures in the scientific revolution, of course, there's Copernicus. He's got an observatory named after him close by, who reshaped the thinking about the solar system from a group of planets that go around the Earth to the Earth being one of the planets that go around the sun. Okay, the difference between geocentric, where the Earth is the center, and heliocentric, where the sun is the center. I have all these old hippie friends that get worked up about Mercury in retrograde. And I always, well, sometimes point out to them that it doesn't really go backwards. Mercury is never really going backwards. It only looks that way if you assume that the Earth is at, stationary. Okay. They don't buy it. They don't buy it. Then they mentioned Galileo in here. Galileo has a very important place. He was teaching Copernicus's theory, heliocentrism, and the Catholic Church was very upset by this because in the Bible it says something about God has set the foundations of the earth and blah blah blah, and I don't mean to blah 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 the Bible, but I just did. And he gets called before the Pope, and the Pope basically threatens to burn him at the stake if he doesn't stop teaching. And Galileo stops teaching because he's a wise man who wants to live. And he knows eventually the truth will out. I once read a history book where they said the author accused Galileo of being a coward. And I thought to myself, well, this guy probably has a home in Cambridge, and then some kind of country home in Vermont or New Hampshire, and drives a Volvo, has 2 kids in college, a full refrigerator, a washer dryer right in his house. Nobody's ever molested him or he's never harassed by the police or anything like that. And I thought, boy, that's some nerve to call Galileo a coward in that situation. Kepler's important. Newton is important. Newton's an interesting guy. He's got a lot of contributions in optics and laws of motion. a basic model of how gravity works and how the solar system is held together. He invents the calculus. I don't know if any of you have taken a calculus course. I tried it once. It's not for me. But he and a guy named Leibniz, who's in Germany, sort of come up with the calculus at the same time, around the same time. And Newton's model wins out because the way it's written is better. It's more efficient. It works better. Okay, so he gets the credit for creating calculus. But I'd like to ask you to think back. 1200 or something. Fibonacci brings in the Arabic numerals. Could Newton have invented calculus with Roman numerals? I don't think so. I think that's highly unlikely. Okay. Now I'm going to write up the paper assignment very soon, but I thought I would excuse me. I thought I would mention it today so that you can think about it and maybe get started on it. The textbook is broken up into 3 parts, 5, 6, and 7, right? 5, 6, and 7. And in each chapter, that's the brief contents. If you go to the long contents, each chapter has a sources of the past section in it. I don't know where it is. Here, there's one. Sources of the past. Okay. These are primary documents, primary source documents. There's one on Christopher Columbus in chapter 19, Adam Smith in chapter 20, first impressions of Spanish forces in chapter 21, sources from the past, Olodai Equiano on the Middle Passage in 22, Fabian Foucan, Deus Destroyed in chapter 23. Chapter 24 is a conqueror and his conquests, Babur on India. and then it's part 6. What I want you to do for the first paper is choose one of these sources of the past pieces. They're relatively short. And I want you to write a 5-page paper, so you're going to have to do some other research. And basically, I want you to give me the context for the document. That is the events surrounding the document. Columbus, well, the Portuguese are going around Africa. He thinks he has a different idea. You might say something about why does Columbus want to go to China? I never understood that, because when I was a kid, TV ads for this organization called CARE and some other advertisements had me convinced that Africans, Indians in East India, and the Chinese were poor, very poor, and had always been poor. And then why does Columbus want to go to China if they're so poor? But they're not poor. The Indians are very prosperous. The Chinese are very prosperous and sophisticated civilizations. And even the Africans are not in such bad shape as you might think, okay? But you might talk about some of that. If you do Adam Smith, it's this early capitalism, trying to figure out what changes are taking place economically. Any of those others, I know Equiano Oladao is a very interesting person who was taken as a slave and then got his freedom at some point. That's in chapter 22. So, so you're going to do the context of the document. You might do something about the slave trade and then the numbers of people taken and who started it and who's doing it at later dates. Then tell me what the document says in your own words. Don't just quote it, but tell me what it says in your own words. And then, to give you a little bit of a break, I want you to tell me your opinion of the document. What did you think of it? Did you learn anything from it? Was it worth reading? That sort of thing. Okay? It's kind of the opportunity for you to be a little fluffy, You don't have to be so hard facts orientated in that. But I will write up a description for that. Okay? So to sum up, there's a transformation taking place in Europe. It's from feudalism to capitalism. And it's going to take a while, but it's starting already. The bourgeoisie is a key element that allows the monarchs to sort of free themselves from control or interference from the nobles. And these things they're all sort of interlocked. The scientific revolution, the bourgeoisie, the Reformation, literacy. Protestants basically insist that you read the scriptures, that a person reads the scriptures. The Catholic Church, for the longest time, didn't really care if you read the scriptures or not. In some cases, they didn't want you to read the scriptures. There's a guy named Wycliffe in England, I think in the 1300s, but don't quote me on that, gets burned at the stake or something because he's published a New Testament in English. And the church doesn't want ordinary people reading the scriptures, which I don't understand why, but maybe they get wild ideas about cleaning out the temple and stuff like that and figure out who the Pharisees and Sadducees are. I don't know. Could be any of those things. But literacy and the Protestant Reformation is connected, and the bourgeoisie is connected to literacy and printing, and this wealth flowing in from the Middle East. Even after the Crusades are over, 1250, the Muslims drive out the Europeans. But even after that, Italian merchants are going to the east and trading with those people. Yes, we're at war, but there's money to be made. It's like Milo Minderbinder in Catch-22, if anybody gets that illusion. Yeah, so that's the sum up. Finally, when we get to chapter 21, we start talking about other parts of the world besides Europe. It's kind of tedious how much Europe dominates things, but chapter 21 is New Worlds, the Americas, and Oceania. So there's some good stuff in there. Okay. So you might want to think about that assignment, maybe look over these documents.